I cannot think of any other achievement that ranks with what was accomplished.
In 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, K-129, disappeared without warning in the depths of the Pacific Ocean.
The Soviets called these patrols war patrols. To them, we were at a state of war, and they took this very, very seriously.
No distress signals, no debris, just silence. And for over half a century, the world was told it was a tragic malfunction. But in 2025, newly declassified U.S. intelligence files exposed a far darker reality. What if it wasn't an accident? What if someone tried to launch a nuclear missile and failed? And what if the Cold War nearly turned hot, without anyone realizing it? What really happened aboard K-129, and why was it buried for 57 years? The vanishing. On the icy morning of February 24, 1968, a sleek silhouette slipped away from the snow-laced port of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Beneath the waves moved K-129, a Soviet Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine, nearly 100 meters of cold steel, silence, and devastating power. On board, 98 men, 3 nuclear-tipped R-21 missiles, and orders locked in secrecy. The mission had a name, War Patrol, a grim designation that left no room for ambiguity. In the language of the Soviet Navy, it didn't mean readiness. It meant war was already assumed. K-129 was tasked with quietly pushing deep into the Pacific, shadowing American naval forces, poised to strike if the unthinkable became necessary. For nearly 2 weeks, it moved undetected through the deep blue silence. Then, on March 8th, a short, routine transmission crackled through encrypted channels, the last voice Moscow would ever hear from the submarine. After that, nothing. No contact, no pings. Just a hollow silence where life had once been. Commanders waited, then waited longer. When K-129 missed its next scheduled check-in, the Navy's optimism gave way to anxiety. Soon, anxiety turned to panic. Within hours, Soviet ships and aircraft were mobilized in a frantic search, scouring thousands of square miles of empty ocean. But there were no distress signals, no oil slicks, no floating debris. The water had swallowed everything. A weapon of mass destruction, its entire crew, and every trace of their mission, gone. A nuclear submarine, gone without a trace, and no one was supposed to find it. Back in Moscow, explanations collapsed under the weight of their own absurdity. Mechanical failure? Collision? Mutiny? None explained the sheer absence of evidence. None gave back the 98 lives. What vanished with K-129 wasn't just a vessel. It was the certainty that any military operation, no matter how secure, was ever truly invisible. As Soviet officials scrambled for answers, one chilling possibility lingered. If the Soviets couldn't find it, maybe someone else already had. But how? Had it simply vanished? Or had someone else been watching? Silent surveillance. The Soviet Navy scoured the Pacific in desperation, searching for something that left no trail. But halfway across the ocean, inside American naval command rooms, the silence was anything but mysterious. Because the United States had already heard it. On March 8, 1968, the exact day K-129 vanished, a sharp, low-frequency disturbance echoed through the deep sea, powerful, abrupt, and unmistakable. It had traveled through a hidden web stretching across the ocean floor. SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. For years, the U.S. Navy had secretly built this underwater network of hydrophones, designed to detect Soviet submarines long before they approached American shores. To an ordinary ear, the sound would have meant nothing. But to trained analysts, it was a red flag. It didn't resemble natural seismic activity. It wasn't a whale call or an undersea landslide. The pattern was brief, violent, and final, consistent with a catastrophic underwater implosion. Within hours, multiple listening stations triangulated the origin of the acoustic event to a remote patch of ocean, roughly 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii. That placed it far from Soviet-controlled waters and directly in the crosshairs of Cold War interest. In internal reports, the event was quietly marked as a probable Soviet submarine loss. But the US never issued a warning, never offered assistance, never informed the Kremlin, because they didn't just want to find the wreck, they wanted to own it. Beneath the surface of diplomacy, intelligence briefings took a sharp turn. The CIA and US Navy recognized the implications instantly. A Soviet sub, likely nuclear-armed, had sunk in international waters beyond Soviet retrieval range, and Washington knew exactly where it sank, and they told no one. In that moment, a new operation began. One not focused on rescue or cooperation, but salvage. Inside a sealed planning room, intelligence officers were already sketching something few thought possible. Recover the wreck, uncover its secrets, and do it without the world ever finding out. The wreck lay in one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth. Dark, silent, untouched. The Soviets had no idea where to look, but the Americans did, and they weren't going to let the opportunity slip beneath the waves. Shortly after the SOSUS data pinpointed the likely location of the explosion, the US Navy activated a quiet directive. A submarine unlike any other was ordered to deploy, the USS Halibut. Originally built to carry nuclear missiles, Halibut had been reconfigured into a high-tech surveillance platform, outfitted with experimental deep-sea photography equipment, manipulators, and sonar arrays. Its new mission had no official name, only a code name: Operation Sand Dollar. The journey to the site was long and perilous. The target lay under more than 16,000 feet of ocean, in a region of near-perpetual darkness and extreme pressure. In 1968, no manned vessel had ever attempted a salvage at such depths. The technology was barely ready, but the risks were accepted. The prize was too important. After weeks of searching in silence, the wreck was found. Through grainy, slow-transmitting cameras lowered into the abyss, the crew of the Halibut saw it: the shattered remains of K-129. The submarine was broken into at least two large sections. The bow section appeared partially intact but heavily scarred. The hull showed clear signs of an internal blast, pressure outward, not inward, suggesting a detonation from within. Burn marks, structural buckling, torn bulkheads. It hadn't imploded passively. Something had gone violently wrong inside. Among the wreckage were torpedo tubes, some twisted, others still sealed. The missile compartment had collapsed, but fragments of what looked like warhead casings were visible, distorted but unmistakable. A machine built for silent destruction had died screaming at the bottom of the Pacific. What the cameras captured was worse than anyone expected. When the photos and footage were returned to Washington, they were immediately classified at the highest level. A team of CIA analysts, naval engineers, and weapons experts pored over the images in silence. There was now no doubt. This wasn't just a sunken submarine, it was a vault. A nuclear-armed time capsule packed with secrets the Soviets had never intended to lose, and the Americans had no intention of leaving behind. The billionaire cover story. The wreckage of K-129 had been located. Its remains were sprawled across the ocean floor like the shattered bones of a dead secret. The implications were overwhelming: nuclear weapons, encrypted Soviet systems, and the undeniable evidence of a catastrophic internal event. The CIA saw it for what it was: not a wreck, but an opportunity. But how do you raise a sunken Soviet submarine in the middle of the Cold War without triggering a global incident? You lie. And to sell a lie that big, the CIA needed a name the world couldn't ignore and wouldn't question. They turned to Howard Hughes. The eccentric billionaire had a reputation built on audacity. He owned aviation empires, dabbled in cutting-edge marine technology, and lived in a world few understood. Hughes was a mystery in motion, and that made him perfect. When the CIA approached him with a proposal cloaked in layers of secrecy, he didn't need all the details. He gave them what they really needed: legitimacy. With Hughes's name front and center, the U.S. quietly began constructing one of the most advanced ships ever built, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Its public purpose? Deep-sea mining. The ship was said to be designed to extract manganese nodules, mineral lumps scattered across the ocean floor. The scientific explanation sounded complex enough to confuse the public and boring enough to dissuade suspicion. It worked. News outlets reported it. The public moved on. The Soviets, preoccupied and unaware of the true location of K-129, didn't blink. Beneath that harmless cover, the truth was far more daring. The Glomar Explorer was a recovery vessel, equipped with a massive mechanical claw nicknamed Clementine, a secret moon pool, and enough precision engineering to attempt what had never been done: lift a 2,000-ton Soviet nuclear submarine from 3 miles beneath the sea. The project would cost over $350 million, the most expensive covert operation in U.S. peacetime history. The media believed the cover. The Soviets suspected nothing. And while the world looked the other way, the CIA prepared to raise the dead and steal what Moscow thought was lost forever. From that moment forward, the mission shifted. No longer a question of where or what, but how to steal it without the world ever knowing. The impossible lift. In July of 1974, after years of planning and over $350 million in covert funding, the Glomar Explorer arrived at a quiet stretch of the Pacific. There were no flags, no fanfare, just the slow, deliberate hum of machinery preparing to do the impossible. Below the hull, the ship's most secret weapon stood ready. A massive mechanical claw, codenamed Clementine, waited behind the sealed doors of the moon pool. It had been engineered to do what no machine had ever attempted: descend nearly 3 miles, locate the shattered hull of a Soviet submarine, and bring it back, intact. Engineers on board worked around the clock. As Clementine was carefully lowered into the blackness, every movement was monitored with surgical precision. Hours passed, then days. When the claw finally reached the ocean floor, sonar confirmed what the CIA had gambled everything on. A large section of K-129 lay within reach. The arm extended, locked onto the wreckage, and began its ascent. For a time, it worked. Clementine gripped a portion of the submarine believed to contain the missile launch systems, cryptographic equipment, and part of the forward crew compartments. The lift was slow, steady, inching upward toward the ship's concealed moon pool. Then, a lurch. Under the immense pressure, part of the wreckage snapped apart. 2/3 of the captured section broke free and plummeted back into the abyss. But what remained in Clementine's grip was enough. The recovered piece was brought aboard, hidden from view by the ship's hull. Inside were Soviet codebooks, technical documents, decaying equipment, and bodies. American officials would later confirm that at least 6 sailors were recovered from the wreck. They were buried at sea in a ceremony recorded but never publicized until decades later. What wasn't shown was what else had been recovered. They lifted the dead and the weapons they carried. Among the wreckage were nuclear torpedoes, their casings corroded but unmistakable. Every piece was cataloged, photographed, and quietly transported to U.S. facilities. The CIA named the mission Project Azorian. The public knew nothing. The Soviets remained unaware. And while one part of K-129 slipped back into silence, the rest now belonged to Washington. A grim victory pulled from the deepest grave the Cold War had ever dug. What the CIA found but never confirmed. For more than 5 decades, the full story behind K-129 remained locked away inside secure vaults, classified memos, and redacted naval reports. The American public knew almost nothing. The Soviet Union said even less. But within U.S. intelligence circles, the submarine's recovery raised serious, unsettling questions. Questions that were never officially answered. The photographic evidence collected during Project Azorian, though never publicly released in full, revealed signs that K-129's sinking may not have been caused by accident alone. According to declassified internal CIA assessments and naval recovery briefings from the 1970s, one detail stood out. scorch marks around the missile compartment. The heat damage wasn't consistent with seawater corrosion or structural collapse. A classified analysis suggested the burn patterns might have come from a failed or aborted ignition sequence. Nearby, electrical control panels appeared damaged in ways suggesting possible manual tampering or override. Nothing about the damage looked routine. That evidence, paired with SOSUS acoustic signatures from March 8, 1968, created a profile that didn't match a passive implosion. The underwater event was sharp, sudden, internal. Analysts noted it sounded more like a detonation inside the vessel than any collision or depth-induced collapse. Even K-129's location raised doubts. Its patrol route placed it well outside standard operating zones for its class. Most Gulf II-class subs weren't assigned to deep Pacific routes. Those were typically reserved for newer, longer-range Yankee-class boats. So why was K-129 deployed so far, so deep, and so alone? Some believed it may have received non-standard orders, perhaps even direct from political authorities in Moscow, rather than the usual naval chain of command. Others speculated that a rogue actor aboard could have initiated the missile sequence without authorization, a theory that, while never proven, was taken seriously by U.S. analysts reviewing the evidence. Still, without official records from the Soviet side, the truth remained out of reach. What the CIA recovered wasn't just metal, wires, and warheads. It was a fragmented narrative, one hinting at instability, internal conflict, or something even more dangerous. They didn't just lift a wreck, they uncovered a moment where nuclear war might have been seconds away. And the world never knew. If the K-129's missile launch sequence had reached completion, history would have unfolded in ash and fire. The submarine's 3 R-21 nuclear ballistic missiles had the range to strike Pearl Harbor, or potentially targets deeper inside the American mainland. One warhead was enough to trigger retaliation. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction ensured that a single launch, verified or not, would have invited an overwhelming U.S. response, nuclear, swift, and total. For decades, this scenario was speculation. But after reviewing internal CIA assessments and acoustic data from 1975, the pieces began forming a terrifying picture. A launch sequence had begun. What stopped it remains debated. A systems malfunction? Sabotage? A last-minute decision by someone on board who understood the weight of their orders? There was no definitive answer, only silence where communication should have been. Project Azorian, it turns out, was never just about recovering a wreck. It was about containment. The U.S. wasn't simply curious about what happened. They were terrified by what almost did. They needed to understand if a rogue nuclear strike had been attempted, and how close they had come to a second Hiroshima. The stakes weren't political. They were existential. Inside the recovered section, CIA engineers found physical evidence that suggested tampering. Scorch marks, failed circuits, signs of a manual override. Taken together, these fragments told a story of something far more dangerous than an accident, a near launch, a moment where one submarine, deep in the Pacific, stood on the edge of ending the world. To the public, Project Azorian remained a salvage mission. But within intelligence circles, it became something else entirely, a quiet reckoning. The truth of that March day in 1968 was never shouted. It was studied, analyzed, buried. Because what the world nearly witnessed wasn't just a Cold War crisis. It was the closest humanity came to annihilation without ever realizing it. So, what do you think really happened aboard K-129? Was it sabotage, a failed launch, or something we'll never fully understand? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story as chilling as we did, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more hidden history that was never meant to surface. Thanks for watching.